Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I am the chief economist at American Compass, and we have a very interesting episode for you today. Was really excited to have the opportunity to speak with Professor Ernesto Zedillo. He is a professor at Yale University and teaches a class at the Jackson School of Global Affairs called Debating Globalization. Perhaps more interestingly, he is the former president of Mexico and helped to lead that country through the mid-1990s after NAFTA went into effect. And he saw what was going on with the development of free trade from that perspective. I had the opportunity to spend some time at the Jackson School a couple of weeks ago, did some interesting events, got to speak with a lot of students, and I just found it to be a terrific test case for how thinking about globalization is changing, both, among academics, among students, among future leaders. And Professor Zedillo is obviously right at the heart of it. So I was delighted that he agreed to come and talk with us about his perspective. What are the debates around globalization? What are the best arguments on all sides? What have we learned over the last 30 years? What needs to be different in the future? So I think you'll find that really interesting. But before we get to it, I have to tell you, of course, what else is going on at Commonplace. We took a little bit of a break for Thanksgiving, but had some great Thanksgiving-related content, including my very important piece on how to shut down your BoomerCon uncle at the Thanksgiving table. Apologies to all the BoomerCons out there who were offended, but it's important to learn a lot about tariffs, and this was a good opportunity to do so. A teachable moment, as our friends on the left might say. I had a good roundup of just some other great stuff from the year that you might have missed, so if you are newer to Commonplace, go click over to that. And then we've just got a new piece up I really like from John Ehret, Young Men Refuse to Fight in the Hunger Games Economy. This is a theme that I've seen coming up in a lot of discussions about the way the economy feels like a lottery. There is still technically opportunity to get to the top, but it is harder, fewer do it, and the consequences for not being the winner feel a lot more dire. And so I think the Hunger Games is a great way to think about it. Really nice piece from John on how this looks from the perspective of young men in particular. So please go give that a read and enjoy this conversation with Professor and former President Zedillo. And we are joined now by Professor and former President Ernesto Zedillo. Sir, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure to be with you, Oren.
We both enjoyed debating globalization. I was at Yale's Jackson School recently for a couple of events, and I was struck by it was the perfectly titled course. And you, as someone who now teaches it and also who lived it obviously firsthand, I think have witnessed these debates from all perspectives for so long. So we're very grateful that you could join us. I guess I wanted to start by asking you, looking back over your own career, how has the debate changed? What have you noticed that people used to fight about and maybe is now resolved, or nobody used to talk about and you're surprised that it's now what everybody's arguing about?
No, I think globalization, trade, international investment have always been contentious issues. If you remember, even in the 90s, which was the roaring 90s, where there was all this optimism about opening up markets and so on. Well, we had the Seattle WTO meeting, where huge demonstrations and even violence took place. And overall, the meeting was a failure because no new round, the Millennium Round, was intended, and it was not really launched. Even in the early 2000s, again, I remember a meeting of the G7 in Italy, demonstrations, violence. I remember the early days also at the World Economic Forum. The police would come because there was this fear, and it's a very isolated place, by the way. So the topic has been contentious. I think what has changed is, let's say, the convergence of people who used to be naturally, because of their political tendencies, anti-trade, fearful of trade, and now people who belong, for example, in the case of the United States, but in other parts of the world too, to parties or movements that used to be pro-trade, Now there is some convergence. I think that's an interesting move. However, in the middle, it seems that people overall continue to believe that trade, globalization, interdependence is good, but with many more footnotes to it. That's, I think, the big difference. I would say another big difference is the narrative that political or intellectual leaders have provided about this. And I think that has been influential. I mean, ideas, whether right or wrong, are influential because ideas are repeated, are discussed, are argued, are debated, and they end up molding to some extent opinions. And of course, I think there was, from the very beginning, an issue which is, I think is worthwhile considering, and that is that trade and globalization was oversold. I think traditionally, trade and globalization is imputed more benefits and more ills than those that it deserves. And sometimes there is this political temptation, either to overemphasize the benefits, depending on the particular political business cycle circumstance, and sometimes there is the temptation to overemphasize the potential or real downsides of globalization. So that's what an old man has seen over the last 30 years.
No, that's fascinating. It strikes me that one thing that has changed, if I think back to the Seattle protests and so forth, the arguments, as you said, they were very much coming from the left. Some of them were coming from labor. A lot of them were coming from activists who were mostly concerned about the effects of globalization on the developing world. I think there was a much broader assumption that surely for a country like the United States, globalization was such a wonderful idea that we were somehow imposing it on the rest of the world to benefit ourselves. It seems like, today, certainly a lot of the arguments in the United States are much less about, is this good or bad for Vietnam? Is this good or bad for Mexico? And much more, okay, but what has it meant economically for the United States? And a few things have changed in that respect. Maybe the biggest one is China. In the 1990s, the assumption was, we will embrace China, China will liberalize, and we will all benefit as a result. Do you think, did we get China wrong? And does that matter?
Well, I don't think there were concerns and reservations about China. Let me tell you, the negotiation of China's accession to the WTO took a long time. And you will be shocked to know that the last country that signed to it, after the US actually, was Mexico. My trade negotiators were very tough, very effective, and they made sure to include a number of conditions as it was the United States. So there were concerns. Now, I think the big surprise on the one hand is how fast China itself embraced globalization in aspects that evidently prove in favor of their own development. And that success, I think, has been a kind of shock for the rest of the world. Nobody would expect that China will grow at 10, 15%, for a number of years, having their economy the size that it is now, just a couple of decades after it was still a very poor country. And then the other aspect that has given rise to some concerns is whether China has really played by the rules. Now, that's really a great song, because China can argue that indeed they lowered tariffs and dramatically They changed their laws, particularly on intellectual property rights. They opened sectors that before were totally closed. Even the financial sector has had a big opening. But there is always the question of whether their mixed model, which they are very capitalist in some sense, but then they are very state interventionist in other senses. And I think that has posed a very real problem. Now, the question is what to do about it. And in my view, this is something that should have been dealt with, improving the institutions and improving the instruments that were available already for many years, but that evidently have to be reviewed periodically and be updated. And I think in that there was a lack of vision in the early 2000s to say, okay, we need to update this. China never opposed, let's say, the Doha round, for example. It was more about India or Brazil, the naysayers, and the Europeans and the US were, sometimes they will push for it, sometimes they will be a little bit reluctant, but the truth is that the purpose of reforming these institutions got lost somewhere, and I think that was a missed opportunity to deal in a more, let's say, structural way with issues, challenges that were being posed by China. And of course, China has taken advantage of that, as every country takes advantage of the system that is available to work. They look, every government, and that is the right thing. As a former head of state, I tell you, we have to deal first and foremost with looking after our national interests, right? And I think there was this negligence. And then the financial crisis came, and that was a real shock. Mm-hmm. That sort of, at the beginning, gave renewed interest in updating, reforming the institutions, but then, for many reasons, including domestic political ones, the interest disappeared, and say, okay, no, the system resisted, so let's keep going as we are. And some of us were very concerned, said, come on, guys, we already had a major economic disaster, first and foremost because of lack of international coordination in macroeconomic policies. That was not about trade, and we should do something about it. And it was not done. It was not done, and I think what we are seeing now is to pay the consequences. Yeah. And again, the political narrative is very important. Some people like to say, okay, all these questions have to do with three letters, top, technology, opening, and policy, right? Technology, of course, has been a big factor of what has happened in every...
Well, let me jump in there, though, before we get to technology, because I think, what you said about China was so interesting and is, I think, at the heart of a lot of the debates today, because the question would be, okay, but do we care, right? Like, you described all of the ways that China, maybe was getting away with what it could, that the system wasn't designed as well as it could be. But the consequence of that for a country like the United States, of course, was if the goal was simply to have access to, very large amounts of lower cost goods, China's behaviors helped with that. And so at the end of the day, it seems to me a lot of the debate is really about, but was that a good thing or not? And so when you're assessing how China behaved and what the consequences of that were for the United States or for anybody else, do you see those as problems that it created or as benefits that it provided?
No, well, I mean, I would say depends who you are talking about. Of course, many people perhaps benefited for having cheaper goods at Walmart and other outlets, by having actually jobs in businesses that were part of this global supply chain by working for companies that sold technology to India, to China, and then went to the Chinese market to sell massive amounts of their own products and services. But of course, there were people who lost, and this has been studied. But the losses, the significant losses, and I guess we should be mindful of every person that endures some pain because of foreign competition, not only Chinese, but from other countries. The question is whether that really was about trade or was about other factors that were playing into this picture. If you look at the numbers of these serious studies that you know very well, relative to the size of the US labor market, the so-called China shock is relatively small. On the other hand, the number of consumers or workers that could have benefited from China's engagement in the global economy and certainly in the US economy, well, it's a much bigger number. But still, government should care about those who lost because of China. That's very important. Or because of technology, or because domestic policies were not really attentive to the situation of those people. And I think this is a broader debate. Is this about trade? Is this about China? Is this about technology? Or is it also about failures of the political system to represent the interests of people who should be legitimately and properly represented and have their interests protected or compensated? I think that's, for me, the big question.
Yeah, and it's funny. So one dimension, I think you're right, of the debate is very much how do we weigh the winners against the losers, so to speak, and are there better ways to help those who are harmed or left behind? I think there's also a more structural question. In the U.S., there is now a lot of talk about deindustrialization, the loss of the manufacturing sector. Of course, if we had done other things, you could help those left behind by helping them find other jobs in other sectors. From your perspective, is industry itself important? Does it matter whether or not a country makes things or what things a country makes?
Well, actually, the relative size of the manufacturing sector in the U.S. has been decreasing for almost my age. Mm-hmm. The proportion of jobs in the manufacturing sector has been decreasing since the 1950s. Let's say since the golden age that was achieved right after the Second World War. So it's, we have to be careful when we speak about deindustrialization. What is true is that the structure of the American economy has changed, and actually has changed for the better because it's an economy that is driven to much higher extent than other economies by innovation. I mean, if there is something practically amazing for a long term about the United States is the capacity to innovate, the capacity to develop technologies. And that has had a dramatic impact on the structure of the economy and also on the structure of employment in this country. So I think everything you say is right, but we have to put it into the bigger picture of how the structure has changed and what were the implications of that structural change for some people, a lot of people actually, in the U.S. economy, who were not supported to adapt to the new world in which there were better jobs, better pay, cleaner jobs, but they were not part of that. Mm-hmm. Right? And that is not really the right thing. I mean, this society and practically every society should look for ways to help people to be part of the economy, right? You don't want them to be marginalized, because if they are marginalized, they don't provide their share of progress to the economy.
Yeah. And you mentioned, in relative terms, the manufacturing sector has, been getting smaller for decades and decades. I think it seems to me the debate today is much more about in absolute terms, that it's not just that the manufacturing sector in the U.S. declined as a share of GDP or of employment, but that it actually stopped growing and even shrunk in absolute terms, and that in all of the sectors where the U.S. had been a leader, or many of them, it lost that leadership. I guess there's a factual question, whether you think that happened, and then there's also the question of should that be a concern?
To have this discussion or analysis in the proper terms, we would have to think hard about what does it mean to have industry. Does it mean to have workers in a factory producing with the methods that were developed by the geniuses like Ford or others before them? Or industry means, thinking about computers, or thinking about the cell phones in which you have a genius like Steve Jobs, thinking about the device, hiring literally thousands of engineers, hiring, all kinds of people to be able to produce the final product that will get to the consumer. Well, if you decompose that process, and for me that's an industry. I mean, you could not say that producing advanced computers or advanced phones is not an industry. What happens is that now we can no longer talk about a concrete physical product. Actually, ideas matter a lot. Engineering matters a lot. Technology matters a lot. And you decompose that process into what economists call tasks. It's not about products, it's about tasks within which there are production of some products. And what you see is that the US is very good, let's say, in the initial phases, and then in the second phases, the end phase of the curve. And this curve, economists call it the smile curve, because you have value here, and then you move along, and then goes up. And the US has captured, let's say, the two good sides of the smile curve. Now, in, let's say, manufacturing itself, putting things together, of course, you have players like China, although China is also moving to the upward part of the smile curve now. But then you have the Vietnams, the Mexicos, the Bangladesh of this world. So the question is, what are we talking about? The jobs that are just assembly, or are we defining industry in a broader sense? And in that, the US continues to be by far, let's say, the champion. Although we must admit, the Chinese are coming because their engineering and their innovation capacities are improving. You may argue, is that good? Is that bad? Well, I believe competition is always good, but it has to be fair competition.
Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that the manufacturing in the middle of that curve, there's nothing special about it. If that's not something that the U.S. is doing,
no, depends on the product, because there are also, and I think those are legitimate concerns, the national security reasons. And the U.S., and that's the government's decision, may say, well, actually, we do have an interest in having this assembly done. You don't want to send your, let's say, your jet fighters to be assembled in China, right? You don't want to do that, just to give you a silly example. Well, but I don't think that's a general criteria that applies to everything in the economy. There may be things in which you say, the purely economic reason is not the most important reason. There are other considerations that should be put into the equation. I think that's different from saying, oh no, we want to have all the manufacturing or assembly jobs that we used to have back to the US. Well, that has an opportunity cost. I mean, because right now you are employing people who are using their minds. Many of them don't like to work in a factory, but they like to work from home or from a nice office, you know, in front of a screen. And they also know that those jobs are much better paid today than the jobs that their grandparents had, even if their parents had a good education.
Mm-hmm. And so can the same person who could have been an effective, the typical person who would have been a productive worker in a factory can instead typically be successful working in front of a screen? Is it sort of a training question?
Well, that they work a long time ago, of course. That's a different generation. But I would say that no matter what, an effort should be done for people to be supported and adapted to changes in the labor market. Mm-hmm. You should not allow people simply saying, you know, drop dead, this is modernity, and take it. No, you have to be mindful of providing capacities, helping to have capacities to adapt to the new world, and also check very carefully whether your social safety nets are the right ones. And that's a big question that has to be answered in every country, you know, by their political system, their politicians, and the public. But this is a debate that has to be had. You know, we cannot support a 21st century economy with institutions that were designed for a very different world. And I think that's something we have to discuss seriously.
So when you're teaching, when you're teaching debating globalization, what are the key arguments you see on each side of the debate? What are the couple of things that you highlight as the most important arguments in favor, and the couple of things that are the most important arguments against?
Well, first, I always start when I teach that class, because I teach others, you know, I start by saying, listen, don't think about trade if you don't think really about development, if you don't think about economic history, if you don't think about economic growth. What we are going to see is important, but it's not the beginning or the end of the world. If you are going to think about development, you have to think about many other factors that are important for countries to develop. Trade helps. I mean, there is a long-term association between economic growth and trade, and some people would say the causality goes from trade to growth. Others say, no, growth really helps trade to be more open. In my view, that's not, that's an interesting, but probably not the most relevant question. The most relevant question is, what other things you have to take into consideration if you want to discuss development? Or, in the case of advanced countries, higher productivity, higher economic growth. And I would say, well, trade is important, but there are other things that can be done that are as important or even more important than trade. So you have to put the debate into perspective. Having said that, I insist, you know, don't overstate the upsides, don't overstate the downsides, which I think is very common in this. People go to the extremes and say, no, you know, be objective and be humble on this debate. What I fear is that nowadays the debate has polarized too much, and that has a very important cost, Oren, that we are not looking at other things that may be very important, like the ones we were mentioning before. I mean, what is domestic policy that is needed to make the playing field really level, to give everybody an opportunity to play, you know, and that's basically domestic policy. You don't want to stop technological development, which has been a very important cause of these structural changes in the labor market, probably the most important factor changing the labor market. So you have to think about domestic policy because, and I used to be a politician, you know, for politicians it's always easy to blame others. Of course, the opposing party, for one thing, the foreigners, then this, the trade, the Chinese. Well, all of that is okay, politically, short term. But why don't we look ourselves in the mirror and say, are we doing everything that we can do to make that playing field level for everybody, to have an opportunity to participate in the modern 21st century economy? And I would say for most countries, the answer is no, we are not doing that.
But the class you teach is debating globalization.
Yeah, because it's been a topic of debate for many years. And I have been part of that debate, you know, where you were mentioning, I am glad you mentioned that. I said, you know, at the beginning it looked like unions, environmentalists, and people very much in the left were getting together. In one of my presentations at Davos, they invited me when I was still in office. This was a debate in which the leader of the AFL-CIO was one of the participants. Another participant was the Director General of the WTO, I don't know, a former Prime Minister of Norway, and myself, you know, and I listened all these opinions, and it just came to my mind. You said, you know, a very interesting coalition is coming into place, a coalition of extreme left, a coalition with environmentalists, and some unions, not all of them, and you know, they are getting this alliance to prevent our countries to achieve development by saying everybody has to be protectionist, we should not open to developing countries for trade. This is a very interesting and worrisome alliance. Well, I am afraid that politically, I'm not so sure that societies still think like that, but politicians are now more associated with the idea of for blaming trade, for blaming the others, for things that they should be fixing, and biting the bullet and taking very hard decisions to improve the situation.
Yeah, I think that your point about the polarization is an important one. It seems like this is a debate where you have a lot of people sort of delivering the absolutist view that this is all of the equities are on one side, or no, all of the equities are on the other side. It seems more complicated than that to me anyway. That, you know, from my perspective, the answer is there are times and ways in which globalization can be good, and there are situations and conditions in which it is not working well. What do you impart to your students? How do you equip them to think about when does globalization work, when doesn't it, and how, as future leaders, they should approach the issue?
Well, one thing that I like to emphasize is the fact that, let's say, the rules of engagement agreed or accepted by everybody are very important. In the previous golden era of globalization, the late 19th century, early 20th century, well, there was kind of a guiding principle that, and that was open markets, and then the gold standard, you know, the monetary gold standard will take care of things to achieve the adjustments that were needed for economies to become as interdependent as they were back then. But there was no real attempt to say, if you are going to trade, you have to follow certain rules and you have to be respectful of these practices or that. Well, the price for ignoring that was very high. Of course, there was the war, the destruction of the international trade during the First War, and then the system went back to the old ways. And then we hit the Great Depression. Protectionism came back with extreme force. Some people would exaggerate and say, oh, protectionism caused the Great Depression. That's not true. Protectionism was one variable, but there was monetary policy, lack of activist fiscal policy when the cycle, the economic cycle probably advised to be more proactive. There were many factors, right? Not only trade protectionism, but indeed it was a factor. Well, comes the dealing with the depression, and as part of that, the U.S. says, wait a minute, let's try to rebuild international trade, but let's do it under some rules. That effort that really starts with that U.S. trade law in 1934 is stopped because of the Second World War. However, even before the war is over, the United States says, listen, we need rules of engagement, right? And those rules were developed progressively since the various steps of the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, where very few countries at the beginning participated, until practically getting a universal system that existed. I would say, I don't know whether it still exists or will be recovered, but until a few years ago. In the 1990s, some people were asking, well, we have achieved, except for international migration, the same degree of globalization as far as trade is concerned, and also financial globalization that existed at the peak of the golden era of globalization. And we know it's contentious, and the question is why it has survived since the end of the Second World War, the construction of this system. And the answer was, well, because this time around there are rules. There are rules of engagement, right? And therefore, if we want this to continue working, then we have to keep watching the improvement of those rules and the institutions in charge of oversee the compliance with those rules. And after that, we still got 2.5 decades. And now we are in a very difficult problem. How the world's leaders are going to react to this, I think is too soon to say. I think there might be something that will make them think twice and say, okay, let's get together and try to see what rules of engagement were no good and what rules of engagement should be considerably improved so that we satisfy better, not fully, never will happen, the interests of the various parties. And
Yeah.
I hope that happens.
I think your point about rules makes a lot of sense to me, and it connects to what you were saying initially about the extent to which there were huge problems with China in that we didn't have consequences necessarily for people who don't follow the rules of engagement. So thinking about how the system should work, what should the consequences be? What do you do when you have, now it's a peer of the United States in size, so largest or nearly largest economy in the world that does not play by the rules?
Well, and we have to be careful and look at the facts. The WTO had a mechanism to address controversies. And actually the U.S. Has been a very active user of that mechanism until it stopped working at the end of 2019. Actually, China has also they learned very fast to use it, and other emerging countries, developing countries like my own country, learned to use it. And actually the system was being used and the system was delivered. Many times the WTO found that China was in violation of some of the rules. Then when that judgment came, China's trade partners were authorized to impose, let's say, a cost on China, allowed to legally punish China through trade mechanisms. And most of the time, practically all the time, China and the others say, okay, yes, this is the law, and I will obey the law. Certainly the United States. What happened, however, is that increasingly countries like the US and others started to feel that the mechanism had to do better. In the case of the US, there has been a big issue with anti-dumping. The US traditionally has wanted more latitude to use, let's say, unilaterally anti-dumping. And every time that perhaps they use it in a too lax way, a country, not only China, other countries will sue the United States, and the United States will be found guilty for abusing, let's say, that provision within the WTO. But that always caused a lot of concern from the part of the United States. The question is whether you are going to kill that mechanism or you are going to say, guys, forget about other issues in the agenda. Let's fix that so that you don't punish me in an unfair way, which I believe you have done. I don't know whether that's the feeling or not, but also to discipline more our Chinese friends, who are also constantly being sued, not only by me, but by other countries, because they don't have transparency in their subsidies, and they are supposed to have transparency. They don't have transparency in what the state-owned enterprises do, and that's not acceptable. So you fix the mechanism. But I would say the abiding by the mechanism was quite good until 2019. Perhaps the mechanism wasn't good enough for today, but the abiding, the respect of the mechanism had been quite good by all parties.
Well, right. I guess that's sort of the question, is if we look at sort of what was actually happening with China, with other countries as well, certainly that had, ultimately were pursuing very aggressive export-led strategies that sort of beggar thy neighbor policies. That was a massive problem in the end. Well, I guess it's a question. Do you think that had become, it was a significant problem in the system? And is that something the WTO was really going to be capable of addressing? It seems to me the WTO was set up, certainly at a time when people thought that trade deficits would be self-correcting, and frankly that they were not as concerned by them. Is there a world in which in 2019 we could have just used the WTO appellate body to address these problems?
Right. Yeah, no, evidently the WTO needed to be updated. That is why in November of 2001, a new round was launched, the Doha round. I was there, By then I was just a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, and I was invited to attend the meeting to advise the Director General, Mike Moore. That was the idea, that a new round was needed to improve the institution. But there were two issues. It was a too ambitious agenda, and also they again went for something that is called single undertaking. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And then there is a tradition, not really a legal principle, that says everything at the WTO has to be approved by consensus, unanimous consensus. So everybody has, in principle, veto power. So having an ambitious agenda and granting every member of the WTO veto power was an invitation to fail, as it indeed.
Right, but that is the WTO design. I mean, how many rounds started and failed after?
Design.
But there was never a successful round after 1995. right?
No, it was, no. Well, after 1995, still in 1995, there was the IT agreement on information technology. And I think the problem was not only the failure to update the instrument, but also the fact that there was a proliferation of preferential trade agreements, where countries found the introduction of other disciplines easier to negotiate. And this is a very interesting point, because I can give you two examples. TPP, TPP was really promoted by the United States. And TPP was perhaps the most ambitious trade and investment instrument ever negotiated, because it introduced disciplines that were much more, let's say, robust than disciplines that the ones that existed in the WTO and in other trade agreements. But then the United States decided at the last moment to withdraw from the agreement that it had been promoted. So that's one issue. The other issue is that actually the United States and China had been negotiating a bilateral investment agreement, where the United States said to China, if you want to have this agreement, you have to accept a series of disciplines on government procurement, on state-owned enterprises, on subsidies, on this, on that. Well, I am told, and it's written by the former USTR, that China practically had accepted that bilateral investment agreement, and then there was a political change in this country, and the agreement was forgotten. So my only point is that trade diplomacy should be given an opportunity before we go into a more complicated scenarios. I think trade diplomacy has delivered a lot. I'm not saying that trade has delivered immensely, because I insist trade is only one among many economic policy instruments, but I would say trade diplomacy delivered a lot, and I think still trade diplomacy should be given a chance. Because if you don't like that, think about the alternative, and the alternative may not be nice.
Yeah. So we are just about out of time. I guess I will wrap up just with a final question to clarify on this point, because I think 2019 is an interesting, it's a very helpful turning point in a lot of ways, and there are different ways to evaluate the world at that point. You could say in 2019 globalization was working certainly well enough. We should have stayed the course. We could say no, it was clearly broken, but the WTO provided the remedies. We could say it was broken and the WTO was inadequate. We needed an ambitious WTO reform. Or you could say it was broken. We weren't going to be able to reform WTO. We're going to have to think about what comes next. Or maybe that's my set of four options. Maybe there are others. How would you choose one of those, or how would you describe where we should have been going at that point?
I would say of course, 2019 is an important year to think about it for many reasons. But I think the expression of this crisis had occurred before. In 2018, based on an investigation that anybody can read, based on Section 301 of one of the U.S. trade laws, the U.S. declared literally a trade war against China. But even before that, allies of the United States, trade partners like Mexico and Canada, had been imposed tariffs unilaterally, perhaps in some contradiction with the then existing NAFTA. So that probably was not the most constructive example that could be given to the world. Once the most respected partner starts, having second thoughts about the abiding by the rules, well, the others start also having second thoughts. I think 2019 was critical because by the end of that year, the dispute settlement mechanism no longer had a functioning appellate body because there were not enough judges to decide on cases. And since then, the institution, has continued to do things, but this was a critical function of the WTO, and that was paralyzed back then. It didn't help that the next year we had the pandemic. I mean, we have had a series of events. It's like an accident. Many difficult things happening around the same time. And that, I think, has conspired against looking at these issues in a more positive, looking forward, way. It seems to me that somehow we are fighting 19th and 20th century fights with instruments of the 20th century, early 20th century, when we have a totally different problem in front of us. I mean, what are we going to do about technology? And my worry is that this neo-protectionism could accelerate actually the adoption of technologies that will be job destructive, right? Because
isn't that the same thing as saying would boost productivity?
Well, yes, but boost productivity means that for the same level of output, you will have less people employed, right? That's the same thing. You will have much higher product per worker. So for the same level of output, you will have less employment. Whether, again, if you don't support people to be part of that, you could have a very serious social problem. And that's the kind of discussions we should be having. It's not about to stop the development of artificial intelligence. No, because you cannot destroy knowledge, and people will still continue to do work on that. But I think we should be posing the question, what do we do in this new world in which we have this incredibly IT capacity, including, by the way, 3D printing? So we may be accelerating the arrival of a world in which a factory is a bunch of 3D printers with no workers, right? So the question is, where are those workers that are left will be employed? And I think these kind of questions we should be raising at this point and really not fighting, all fights with all instruments, in my view. But that's just my opinion.
Well, we will leave things there. Thank you for sharing your opinion and making the time to join us. We really appreciate you coming on the show.
No, I am very pleased to be part of it, and I wish you great success in the show.
Same to you. Happy holidays to all, and we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.